There is, in my opinion, no more feminist a film than Chicken Run, and I sincerely believe that. Children grow up to be adults, some of them will end up running our society. We should be making sure that what they are watching is something that we want them to grow up and internalize.
Dr. Reuben Fong, film buff, self-proclaimed big kid, buzzkill?
One of my favorite party tricks is asking someone what their favorite children's film is and ruining it for them.
Disney has done so much in the last few decades to really modernize its programming.
This Disney movie has landed a Bay Area teacher in some trouble, and it features a gay character in a prominent role.
The Wild Thornberry's movie is certainly a white savior narrative, and I apologize for ruining this film for anyone who was a fan.
The film that we're going to look at is Ratatouille, the 2007 Pixar Disney film, possibly my favorite animated film. That is what we're about to dive into.
Using animals in children's films, you can sneak in some subversive or not necessarily conscious messages, right? You can tell stories that maybe children wouldn't ordinarily sit through.
This episode comes with a warning. It may somewhat ruin Ratatouille for you, and Stuart Little, and Chicken Run, and The Land Before Time. Because today we're talking about children's films, specifically films that feature anthropomorphic characters. Basically, any animated movie that has animals who talk or act like a human in some way, shape, or form. Why, you ask? Well, you won't believe the messaging that those characters, their relationships, and the stories they inhabit are sending through the screen. And guess who's taking in all that messaging? Our kids. Let's press play with Dr. Reuben Fong. This is PhD Unpacked.
How did you wind up deciding that academia was the path that you were going to take?
Well, I sort of fell into it. So my family are very big into education. They're very supportive. And so both of my sisters, they're older than me. They went to university. All my cousins are older than me. They went to university. So it was really expected of me. I had to go to university. I didn't really know what for. I just knew I had to go and do something. And I had okay grades for media studies in high school, so I thought I'd continue doing that. And I thought maybe I'd go to university. I'd become like an actor or like a screenwriter. I didn't have any real fixed path. But then what happened was I got to university, and I think the middle of my first year of university, I watched my media lecturers just blow my mind with insights. And they weren't necessarily insights about filmmaking or, about cinema. Because media studies is not just about how to make films. It's a part of that. But a lot of media studies is about learning about the world in which we live through the media that we're watching. So a lot of the time, these media lecturers who were blowing my mind weren't talking just about films, they were talking about things in the real world. And, I think by the end of my first year of university, I looked at all those lecturers who impressed me and I thought, I got to do that somehow. And, in order to become a lecturer, you need a PhD. So I started thinking, at the end of my bachelor's degree, what was I going to do a PhD on? I had this half-hearted idea to write about North Korean cinema because I was interested in geopolitics and propaganda at the time. So I went to the PhD advisor for our department and I said, hey, maybe I should write about North Korean cinema. And the advisor said, yeah, but you got to remember two things. One, you have to learn how to speak Korean, which I don't. I sadly can't speak Korean. And they also said, and you might be on some government watch lists for the rest of your life. So that sort of was the end of that. That's as far as that got.
Yeah.
So then I started thinking, well, what else could I be doing? And I really did want to write about children's films for two reasons. One is I'm a big kid. I love the Muppets. I love a lot of, I think a lot of the Disney stuff holds up. So children's films was something I was really interested in. And for my master's degree, I wrote my dissertation about anthropocentrism in children's films, that idea that humans are the most important animals, or the idea that humans are not animals at all. And I looked at that through the lens of children's films because that thinking, starts very young. And as what happens with most PhD candidates, I'm sure, is I got to the end of my master's and thought, I have only scratched the surface of this. I need to take this way further. And so I ended up talking to the people who became my PhD supervisors, and they said, there is something interesting here about talking animals and the way that, those anthropomorphic animals tell children and tell adults something about who we are.
You outlined 5 different categories, different kinds of anthropomorphism, with a few different films within each category, and we probably won't have time to go to every single film. I think you mentioned you probably watched over 50 films in the research of this. There's no time to talk about all 50, but in the research you point to a few different key films, and I've chosen sort of one within each category to explore. Let's start off with the first category of anthropomorphism that is explored via the film, the absolute classic Chicken Run. The 2000 stop-motion animation film by the Aardman production house, sort of famously known for... They Wallace and Gromit?
Wallace and Gromit, yes.
Gromit, right? I watched Chicken Run last night as preparation for this. I must say, for the first time in years, for me, it existed as like the great childhood scary film that existed in my psyche. I don't think I've seen Chicken Run for like 10 years, and I've been thinking about it for the last wee while, and then along comes this interview, a reason to sit down and watch it. Can you tell us about the category of anthropomorphism which you've called lost in translation? Maybe before we dive into Chicken Run specifically, what is lost in translation as a category of anthropomorphism?
So lost in translation refers to films, children's films with anthropomorphic animals who cannot communicate with humans, right, on any level. And so this is really the lowest level of that phrase I used before, phenomenological proximity. And so, there is definitely these idea of binaries. So the idea between human, non-human is definitely emphasized by that. And I think that because that, we often think of gender as a binary, and I'm not saying that gender is a binary, but historically that has been one way in which that aspect of identity has been understood, that lost in translation films often emphasize that gender aspect, and when you look at those anthropomorphic animals and their relationship with humans, it really emphasizes that masculine feminine dyad. And children's films, haven't gotten enough attention from critical thinkers. Then talking animals in children's films definitely hasn't gotten a lot of attention. And one of the things that's really interesting about that is there are opportunities for filmmakers to be subversive about the stories in which they're telling. Something that I thought about last night is that in America right now, there are a lot of right-wing politicians who are going after drag queens. And trying to stop children from being exposed to drag queens because they think that somehow drag queens will corrupt children, but they will not go after the most famous drag queen of them all, Miss Piggy from the Muppets. Miss Piggy has always been puppeteered and voiced by a man, and you think about it, yes, of course Miss Piggy is a drag queen, but those same politicians who will attack drag queens will not go after Miss Piggy because she's a talking animal in a children's film franchise. She is flying under the radar. And I'm not saying that this is a good or bad thing, but it is something to think about. Children are often seeing ideas through these talking animals in children's films that adults are just not thinking about at all. Anyway, going back to Chicken Run.
Yeah, and lost in translation, I guess something that might be helpful to frame it for people that I found helpful reading the PhD is, in lost in translation films, the animals, like the toys in Toy Story, that when the humans appear, kind of fall on the ground and revert back to their real life state. The animals in lost in translations films, whenever typically sort of seen by human characters act as normal animals, and they fulfill a more, I guess, traditional animal-like space. The thing that is most often projected onto the animals is not age, it's not race, it's not religion. Gender is the thing that is planted on these creatures. And I really like the example that you used about Alex the lion from Madagascar as kind of being this masculine animal that exists in this kind of group of other characters, and you know, what does it mean to be like a masculine animal? But as we think about Chicken Run as an example of lost in translation, can you explain how kind of the specifics manifest in that film in terms of, you know, gender's a big element, violence as well as another element?
When I have discussions about my PhD, this is my go-to line. There is, in my opinion, no more feminist a film than Chicken Run. And I sincerely believe that because Chicken Run is a film about misogynistic institutional control. There's been interesting child developmental studies about how children see difference. And the first difference that children identify is gender. So if you say, what's the difference between these two people, whether it's race, age, class, they go for gender first. And so lost in translation films, I think, because the phenomenological proximity is quite low, and so that human-like quality is there, but it's not fully there, then gender ends up coming to the forefront. So Chicken Run is a film about some chickens who live in an egg farm. Because they are chickens, all of the chickens are coded as women. They lay eggs for the farmers, and if they don't lay the eggs, then the farmers kill them and eat them. I shouldn't sound so happy about that. The chickens have to lay eggs, which is symbolic of feminine gender capital, right? The idea that these chickens, they must be performing their gender identity to the standard of the institution that houses them, or else they are, for want of a better word, murdered by that institution. So these symbolic women who don't live up to the expectation of their gender identity are not only taken out of the institution, they nourish that institution that has been controlling them.
You're not saying that gender is binary. What you're saying is that these films produce a product, a creative medium that suggests to the world, particularly in children, that this is how we are placing these characters within a specific gender trope, and within this specific film, what the narrative says is that the role of women within this world is to serve a job, and if they don't serve that job, they're deemed worthless and literally killed for the pleasure of the humans. And it's really interesting in Chicken Run, you talk about this in your research, that the human characters actually kind of live in this space where, Miss Tweedy is this really strong, assertive, clearly an antagonist, but she is the dominant character of the two, with the Mr. Tweedy, who's the kind of bumbling fool character. And when you think about how the chickens relate to the humans, they don't communicate in the way that, other films that we'll explore, they cannot understand each other. But what the film is clearly stating for everyone that watches it is, within the world of this film, in this kind of concentration camp-esque situation, these feminine characters are forced to do one thing, and ultimately it's an escape story. The chickens are trying to escape from that world, which, when I first watched Chicken Run and they're going through the pie machine, it's really scary, and I can recognize the fear in that story, but I wasn't thinking about, the feminist undertones of it. And when you go back and watch Chicken Run, having thought about these things from reading your PhD, it's like, whoa, this film is saying so much stuff that, you may or may not absorb as a child, but it's there.
One of my favorite party tricks is asking someone what their favorite children's film is and ruining it for them. Yeah. You touch on this interesting point about the Tweedies. So Mrs. Tweedy, is the very domineering, very vicious woman, whereas Mr. Tweedy is very soft. He's very submissive to his wife. And so the idea is that he is not being a very masculine man because he is submissive and he is not taking initiative. And she is not being, quote unquote, a very feminine woman by being, domineering and being very, very vicious. And
wanting to start a successful
Right.
business and
Yeah.
make money.
And this is something that, children's films do a lot, where they will villainize certain characters for not fulfilling that gender expectation, right? The idea that they are wicked somewhat because they are not fulfilling that masculine or feminine identity to which they are supposed to be aspiring.
To the next genre, which you call First Contact. And I will say right off the bat, the film that we're going to look at is Ratatouille, the 2007 Pixar Disney film, possibly my favorite animated film. But before we get to the specifics of that film, can you talk about, I guess, First Contact as an overall genre of anthropomorphism and the key ideas that exist in that sort of genre as a whole?
Yeah, so First Contact films are films where an animal and a human learn to communicate, and that they learn that they have roughly equal sentience. So Ratatouille is one, B-Movie is another, and these films are all about renegotiating boundaries. And, it's almost like Pocahontas, the idea of when you bring in two different kinds of people together, what sort of limits will be set. And so because these are films that are all about renegotiating boundaries, these are films that I find are often about social class, because social class is something that is often viewed as something that can be changed much more easily than other aspects of your identity. So, changing your race or changing your sexuality or changing your gender, those seem like largely immutable things, but your social class is something that can fluctuate. And so because these are films where humans and animals are renegotiating what they understand as normal, these are films that are often about social mobility. And although they are films about social mobility, the social classes are often marked by, indicators of race and ethnicity. That when children sort of reach primary school age, they are associating certain kinds of identity with each other. And one of the things that they will often pair together is, race and ethnicity with social class. They will make assumptions about people. And I'm not saying that this is that children are problematic for thinking this. This is just something that develops in children's ways of thinking.
Yeah.
So First Contact films are about social mobility, but they're also about race.
Yeah. Let's dive into how this idea of first contact applies within the story of Ratatouille.
Ratatouille is about a rat who aspires to be a great chef, and not just a great chef in the rodent world, but in the human world. So he meets a garbage boy called Linguini, and they eventually learn that they are of the same intelligence, and that Remy, the rat, can manipulate Linguini's body like a puppet through like hiding on his head and pulling his hairs, and they hide him with a chef's hat. And one of the things that's interesting here is that the humans in this film are coded as very upper class. They're most, aside from Linguini, they're all Europeans. They're all gourmands. They work at a very impressive 3-star, a Michelin 3-star restaurant, whereas the rats are coded as very lower class. They've got that sort of New York accent, and one of the things that if you stop to think about it, you're thinking, should you really be portraying the symbolic working class people as rodents?
Yeah.
There is something problematic, I feel, about looking at lower class people or working class people as pests, right? And, if you think about it, that is kind of what the film is trying to articulate about that difference between the working class and the upper class.
Yeah, if you look at Ratatouille on the surface, you think, well, it's a story about someone who wouldn't have access to something, pursuing his dreams, and anything is possible, anyone can cook is the great kind of tagline of the story. But in order to frame that story, what the film does is it puts a certain group of characters, in this case rats, they give them all like a specific New York style accent, and then it says, in comparison to these pests, the upper class French fine dining world, the humans and this style of people are allowed in this institution in a way that other people aren't. And one thing that's really interesting about the film is when the Remy sort of takes control of the cooking, he is still not allowed to be out in the open. Ratatouille doesn't end with Remy being a famous chef, the person that's known to be cooking. The humans go, oh yes, rats can cook. He still has to operate in the background of the kind of human linguine character in the restaurant at the end of the film. So even when some characters within the film world decide, yes, this sort of pest class of people have some talent within cooking, even at the end of the film he has to do it behind the curtain because he's still never accepted within the kind of social class coding that happens in the world, which it's sad because I love the film, and for me it's about beautifully animated cooking, but like you said, when you stop and you take a step back and you're like, what is this film really telling us about two groups of people coming together, interacting for the first time, and ultimately saying that while these two individual characters might deem it okay, the rest of the world will still never accept that these two groups of people can coexist.
Right. So this, Ratatouille is not a film about breaking down social class barriers on a widespread scale. As I said before, the process by which animals are made anthropomorphic is not a neutral process. Ratatouille did not necessarily have to be about rats, right? Why did they choose rats?
Yeah.
And one of the reasons is because there is a difference between a rat and a colony of rats, right? So, I think some people would agree that one rat is quite cute.
Yeah, some people keep rats as pets. They're very intelligent
Right?
creatures.
But hundreds of rats is terrifying and disgusting,
Yeah.
right? And the idea that, when you single out one rat, it goes through this, process of cleansing, right? The idea that because it is one rat, it is not dirty, whereas if it was hundreds of rats, they would be, filthy. And so part of that social mobility that Remy enjoys is, by definition, individual. It is only allowed for him. And, that sort of puts a lid on the amount of social mobility that might be encouraged.
Yeah, and ultimately that is where the film ends. The family of rats do benefit from this kind of new human-animal relationship that happens. But just because they're eating slightly better food at the end does not mean their status within this fictional world in which rats and humans exist together in that sort of way, nothing has actually changed. And I guess to draw back out to this idea of first contact and what those kind of films say about social mobility and ethnic coding is that at the end of the day, and this is the film world speaking, not us speaking, at the end of the day, only so much change is possible, which is like really problematic to put in front of kids. And for all audiences.
Right. Trickle-down ratonomics, I think they should call it.
Yeah. Let's move on to the third genre of anthropomorphism, which is called the Tourist. And the film that we're ultimately going to get to is the Wild Thornberry's movie, the 2002 Paramount Nickelodeon film. Tourist films as this subgenre of anthropomorphism refers to films where there's a very specific relationship between the humans and the non-human characters, which you describe as this kind of artificial form of interspecies kindness. Can you unpack the Tourist for us a little bit more?
So to differentiate the Tourist from First Contact, in First Contact, there is some spontaneous meeting, right, between these two peoples, the humans and the animals.
Remy is sitting over the pot doing the herbs, and this kind of just
just happens. They
Right.
just happen across each
It's something spontaneous and irreversible. Whereas tourist films are about that artificial kinship between humans and animals. So these humans or these animals are, tourists in the other species domain, right? So, as we'll get into, in the Wild Thornberries, Eliza Thornberry can talk to animals, but it's not spontaneous.
So in the Wild Thornberry's world, I mean, many people have grown up watching it, but if you haven't, Eliza Thornberry is this person that is gifted the ability to speak to animals. I think she frees a warthog that turns out to be a shaman. The shaman gifts her the ability to speak to animals, and she just happens to be the daughter of this kind of famous zoological couple that travel the world telling stories and the sort of David Attenborough-esque description and videography of animals in the wild. And of course, Eliza Thornberry there can speak to animals, but no one else must know. How does the Wild Thornberries film explore this idea of the tourist?
So tourist films, because they are films about visiting, another place, I feel that they often lean into this idea of nationality and national identity. That's not to say that all tourist films are white savior narratives, but the Wild Thornberries movie is certainly a white savior narrative, and I apologize for ruining this film for anyone who was a fan.
And the TV show.
And the TV show. But this is a film about a white girl, Eliza Thornberry, who goes to Kenya and tries to stop, some poachers from taking the native animals. And the native animals are stand-ins, right, for the indigenous people of Kenya. Or, if you look at the Wild Thornberries of the show, the animals are often stand-ins for the indigenous peoples. And Eliza Thornberry, in this film, is the only person who seems to care whether or not, these poachers are going to hunt these indigenous animals. And, at the end of the movie, she is the only person who is able to stop the poachers from getting away with, hunting those animals. Talking of the ways in which the film represents Kenya, and this is very common actually in children's films, the idea that if it's a country in Africa, that there aren't really people who live there, right? So the film uses those animals as stand-ins for indigenous Kenyans in the movie. There's that idea that the only way that these white people who are poaching can be stopped is with another white person. Those symbolic indigenous Kenyans have no agency. They don't have any power in the ways in which, white people are going to colonize or dominate, right? So, so there is that idea of white people can do terrible things, but the only way to stop those terrible things is with another white person. And this probably sounds obvious when you hear it out loud. Eliza Thornberry is a white human girl, and the indigenous Kenyan animals are stand-ins for the local, they're stand-ins for Kenyans, and so these Kenyans have been literally dehumanized in the film, right? And not to say that not to say that animal life has less worth than human life, but I think there is a general perception that humans are more important, that we live in an anthropocentric society where humans have more cachet than animals, right? Yeah. So by choosing to have the white characters be human and the symbolic people of color be animals, right? There is that hegemonic difference.
So let's move into the fourth subgenre of anthropomorphism, which is called the post-colonial. And the film that we'll focus on is Stuart Little, the 1999 Columbia and Sony production. Tell us more about the post-colonial as an example of the specific kind of anthropomorphism.
So the post-colonial films are where animals have the highest level of, that phrase I use again, phenomenological proximity, where these animals are, they live very similar, if not identical lives to humans. As we said in the beginning, Who Framed Roger Rabbit has talking animals who live in houses and have jobs and pay rent. Or, if you look at Sesame Street, right? So Sesame Street, they all live in the same buildings. They all communicate with the same language.
They share the same sort of hobbies, and in terms of how they're depicted, there's more of a focus on them having more human-like anatomy, like fingers and toes, and in comparison to, say, Chicken Run, where the chickens, for the most part, are quite chicken-esque. In Stuart Little, he is clothed in different ways, and while he clearly is not human. Within the narrative of that film, he is shown to have similar interests and a lifestyle to humans. Tell us about this idea of kind of sameness or dissimilarities within post-colonial films, because that's kind of at the crux of it, right? The idea that, ultimately, if we put them in a certain situation, animals within these worlds can exist in the same way as humans, which I know seems quite similar to First Contact, but there is a difference, right?
Yeah, so post-colonial films, are different from First Contact in that the starting point is that the humans and the animals are on a level playing field. And so because they're on a level playing field, the difference between the humans and animals often becomes a deconstruction of difference, right? That idea that their difference is not as important as their sameness. And so when you look at Stuart Little through this lens, and I think this is, this again is pretty obvious when you hear it, Stuart Little is not a film about rats. It's a film about disability and the ways in which disability can be overcome. So Stuart Little, he's 2 inches tall, and he cannot initially do all of the things that his foster brother wants to do. He can't play ball with him. But the film's message is that Stuart's foster family, the Littles, learn to accept Stuart, and learn that the differences that make him unique do not disadvantage him with enough time and enough care.
Which I think is interesting, because when I was going through all the different kinds of anthropomorphism, this kind of stood out to me as a potentially, I don't want to say less problematic, but what this subgenre speaks to is the idea that difference can be overcome in a way that, potentially the other side of the coin is First Contact, which the end of Ratatouille says difference cannot really be overcome. One rat can cook in a restaurant, and one food critic might decide that, yes, anyone can cook, but ultimately the society and food in Paris does not change. Whereas within that specific family world within Stuart Little, by the end of the film, the message is that Stuart can be integrated into this world. Which, when I was thinking about it, was maybe Stuart Little, as a film, has a kind of half decent message. What a shock, animated kids film.
Yeah, I'm sure it is. I am not physically. I do not have any physical disabilities, but I imagine that you could tell the story of Stuart Little about a boy in a wheelchair, and it wouldn't be all too different. But again, using animals in children's films, you can sneak in some subversive or, not necessarily conscious messages, right? You can tell stories that, maybe children wouldn't ordinarily sit through. The idea of using the rat as symbolic of a disability gets awareness out there without making it too explicit.
Yeah, and I guess it's an interesting example to suggest, this idea of animals within animated kids films. What you're coming in here with your research is not to say every single animal within a kids film is problematic and teaching our children bad things. Often that is the case, as we have explored. There is a large range of problematic anthropomorphism within films, but it can, there are versions of stories where you can be using animals within the worlds of humans to teach children, positive lessons, as is the case within films and TV shows that we haven't spoken to. For example, you mentioned Miss Piggy and the Muppets as like a really interesting character device. Let's move into the final version of anthropomorphism, which is the sentinel. Can you explain the sentinel category of anthropomorphism and how it is different than the other four?
So the sentinel category are films where there are no humans at all. There are only the animals on screen. And the reason it's called the sentinel is I based it off the North Sentinel Island tribe. The North Sentinel Island tribe live on an island that has so far, largely been untouched by the rest of civilization. And Sentinel films focus, I think, mainly on chosen families. So, we have what we call families of origin, so people who you are born to or people you marry and, have kids with. And then you have your chosen families, the families which you pick up along the way, friends, acquaintances. And the reason for this is that often animals are considered to be extensions of people. So if you think of, someone's pet. So, a lot of men don't like owning a cat because the idea is that would make them less of a man because that cat would be an extension of them. Now, if you have animals where there are no humans around, then those animals don't really have, those animals are not extensions of people. And the idea, and what I think the Sentinel films do is they focus on chosen families a lot of the time, because if they were focusing on families of origin, then there would be this idea that animals would exist, perpetually without people, which is, I think, a hard thing for a lot of people to conceptualize.
Yeah. And these Sentinel films, because there are no humans, ultimately the animals are not predicated on the existence of the humans. And there's a suggestion in your research that because of that, the films can be kind of more about social unity and cohesion because there is not that clash with the human. This idea of chosen family is kind of derived from the rainbow community, and that to quote from your research, that individuals create non-consanguinal, I don't know if that's the right pronunciation, family units where they experience or fear rejection from their born to family. And so that was really fascinating to me, that this idea of chosen families could come from that societal existence, and how that is reflected in these kinds of children's films that feature animals and no humans, and that the animals within these narratives are sort of bound together with people that are sort of thrust upon them for various reasons of a specific story, and have to decide whether those people will become their new family or not. And perhaps in order to unpack that, we should dive into the specific film. I really want to talk about The Land Before Time, because for me that was a really defining. I remember going to the Video Easy video shop and getting The Land Before Time out. I can remember the pain of Littlefoot's mother dying at the start of the film. Tell us about The Land Before Time and what it does from a chosen family story perspective.
Well, first of all, a lot of the films that I chose to write about, I did see as a child and loved. The Land Before Time was not one of them.
Interesting.
But everybody kept talking to me about it, and I felt sort of peer pressured into, giving it a go. And so, you probably will know this off the top of your head. What is the long necks, the main...
So the five dinosaurs are Littlefoot, Ducky, Petrie, Sarah, and Spike. They come across this kind of sixth character, Chomper, which is the young T-Rex. They're all different kinds of dinosaurs.
Yes. So Littlefoot starts with, the mother, and I think there is a grandfather figure.
Yes.
And what you said, that you have Littlefoot's mother, her death is burned into your memory.
Yeah.
One of the things that's affecting about that is it's an exploration of grief. And grief is not something that a lot of children's films will sit with for a while. right? So, Simba does feel sad when his father dies, but it's 2 scenes at most.
And then Hakuna Matata comes in, and
Right.
we're all
Yeah.
happy days.
Or when Bambi's mother gets shot, Bambi gets over that like within 1 scene transition. And so there is a lot of grief there about the death of someone in Littlefoot's family of origin, right? So Littlefoot is sitting with the loss of their biological mother. And then the film, as you say, brings in these other dinosaurs, right, who are very different. And I think it's explicitly said in the beginning of the film that, long necks don't...
They don't associate with each other.
Right.
It's important to say the dinosaur characters didn't grow up on the same playground. They're kind of thrust together in this group of circumstance where they're all trying to go about and have the same goal of reaching this kind of magical place where everything will be okay, the Great Valley.
And so it's by coming together, and especially through that grief of his family of origin, that Littlefoot finds that chosen family, which gives him the strength to carry on to that Great Valley.
And it's all about the friends we made on the way, which is possibly like a popular narrative within lots of kids' animated films. It's all about the friendships you make. It's about the people you meet along the way. What I found really interesting talking about The Land Before Time is at the end of the film, these friendships have been made. The dinosaurs have befriended this sort of T-Rex baby chomper, which shouldn't happen because, meat eater versus plant eater shouldn't cross. But then at the end of the film, they reach the Great Valley and they all rekindle, with the exception of one dinosaur, with their family. And the message of the story is that the family, the born-to family will outlast the friendships. I think it says at the end of the film, and they kind of all grew up together in time. But even though that this film spends so long saying these friends, they meet each other, they go through great strife, when they're given the opportunity to realign with their born-to families, that is where they will kind of always lean towards, which was killer for me because I was like, The Land Before Time, great family story of friendship and chosen families. But actually, when you think about it, at the end, when they reunite with the auntie and the grandpa, and that is ultimately the film kind of suggests that that is all that mattered, that they reunited with that.
Sorry. There's a message that comes across that chosen families are great until you can get back to your families of origin.
Yeah. When you were finishing up your research and you're thinking about these kind of animated kids films, when you think about, the research a few years on, if someone was to ask you about it and then be like, well, why should I care about animated kids films? What is the kind of quick reflection summary of it when we think about all those different ways that animals are used within animated kids films and the specific stories that they tell, both children and adults, anyone who sits down and watches them?
I'm not a parent, so I would never dare to tell parents what films that they should choose, should screen for their kids. But I would want people to start thinking critically about the films that their children are watching. As we've discussed, there are a lot of ideas in these films that you don't necessarily think about as a kid, and when you grow up and start thinking about it, you think, oh, what is this saying, right? And lots of children see films on repeat. I'm sure that I saw Chicken Run 10, 15 times that year that it came out on VHS, and thinking, what is it saying? How are we internalizing certain messages? And, people might blow this off because they're thinking, what's the point? These are children, right? They have no power. But children grow up to be adults. And the kind of society that we want is going to be informed by what the children of today are going to end up thinking tomorrow.
And ultimately, films just, as a part of media studies as a whole, are something that we continue to come back to as a part of popular culture. Me watching Chicken Run last night, me watching the Wild Thornberries a few nights ago. Yes, I came back to them for the purpose of this PhD specifically, but these are always things that continue to exist on Disney Plus, on Netflix, on any of these streaming channels. And I think it's really interesting to think about, most of these films are sort of in the 2000s to 2010s period. where animated films are going now in terms of both animals. There's a lot of films that exist in this kind of non-animal but non-human characters. This sort of films like Inside Out, Elemental, ones that come to mind. As we consider how animated films that are predominantly aimed at children continue to change and shift, being mindful of what are the roles that those characters are playing within those stories and what are they teaching us.
I think a lot of people think of children as dumb adults, right? The idea that how does a child think? Well, like I think, but with less sophistication. But childhood is a fundamentally different experience than adulthood. And I'm not, and it's not to say that children can't relate to adults sometimes, and, sometimes adults can relate to children. But when you are a child, you are experiencing the world in a very different way. And what you are watching, what you are watching as a child affects you differently than it would if you were an adult.
Well, you've given us so much to think about. Thank you so much, Reuben, for coming on to PhD Unpacked and being a part of the show. I look forward to going back and rewatching as many of the films within the thesis as possible, but also thinking about anthropomorphism through films that are not listed in your movie list and films that are coming forward. Before we wrap up, is there anything final that you wanted to add or touch on?
One of the things that I've gotten very interested in the last couple of years is the representation of police in children's media, with the Black Lives Matters protests going on and our rethinking of the criminal justice system, and how Paw Patrol fits into that. My nephew is 1.5 years old, and his first movie was Paw Patrol. And I'm thinking, what are we teaching children about police? In the media that they are watching, and how is that foundational to our understanding of how society is structured?
Well, something that maybe you'll have a time to explore in the years coming as you continue your academic pursuits and journal articles and the like. We will certainly be keeping our eye out to see if you do investigate that. But for now, thank you so much for coming on and being a part of the show. The PhD is a difference of kind. Species and social difference in children's films. Reuben, thanks so much for being here. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for watching this episode from Season 3 of PhD Unpacked. For previous episodes from this season and Seasons 1 and 2, check us out on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, as well as other listening platforms. And follow us, PhD Unpacked, on Instagram and TikTok.